Welcome to the Essential Southern Podcast, where we explore the rich history, culture, and traditions of the American South.
Welcome back to the Essential Southern Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Clanahan, and this podcast is hosted by the Abbeville Institute. Go to www.abbevilleinstitute, Abbeville, institute.org, and help us explore what is true and valuable in the Southern tradition. Your donations are tax deductible to the full extent of the law. All right, well, let's talk about the main topic today, and that is Thanksgiving. Now, you might wonder, well, how is that part of the Essential South? Well, as we know, the real first Thanksgiving in America, the real English first Thanksgiving, was not in Massachusetts with the Pilgrims. It was actually 2 years before that in Virginia, in Barclay, is how they would have said it, Barclay 100, in 1619. Now, of course, Floridians would say, well, wait a second. We had the real first Thanksgiving on the east coast of Florida in September of 1565 at St. Augustine. Well, there was a Thanksgiving there. It had, of course, it was the Spanish colonials disembarked from their ship at St. Augustine and immediately had a Thanksgiving in honor of the Virgin Mary. And they invited some of the local Indian tribes. And of course, they did have a feast, but that was a one-off event. It wasn't supposed to be anything annual. But you could say, well, that is a Thanksgiving. So Florida could claim the first Thanksgiving. But the first English Thanksgiving, the one that was supposed to be annual and perpetual, was in Virginia in 1619. Unfortunately, that settlement was wiped out by an Indian massacre a couple of years later. And so it was forgotten. And as a result, this Plymouth Thanksgiving became the standard narrative for the first Thanksgiving in America. Now, why is the question? Why did that become the standard narrative? And I'm going to get into a piece that we published at the Abbeville Institute this week. The title is Love Thanksgiving, Thank Virginia. It's written by Sean McGowan. It was actually not originally published at our website, but he gave us permission to publish it there. But why is this the case? Why did Plymouth become the standard? Well, that has to do with a New Englander, Sarah Hale. And in the 1840s, she started making it her job to ensure that this New England-centric version of early American history would become the dominant narrative. She started writing about it in various ladies' magazines, and by 1863, Abraham Lincoln issued his Thanksgiving proclamation, and from that point forward, the President of the United States issued a Thanksgiving proclamation every year. And they didn't really talk a lot about history, though it was political. That wasn't until, there was some mention of it several times in these various Thanksgiving Day proclamations, but it wasn't until we started getting to the 20th century that you saw this very New England-centric vision of American history take hold. Now, Hale wanted that. In fact, Northerners thought that Thanksgiving should be celebrated much like July 4th. I mean, after all, it's a day of a founding, right? So, we have this founding day of July 4th, Independence Day. Why not have Thanksgiving be part of that as well? Well, again, Virginia was already there. This is the problem for the New England-centric vision of America, and that's Virginia had already been there for 13 years as a permanent English colony before the Pilgrims showed up in Massachusetts. In fact, they were on their way to Virginia. Now, sometimes you think about that. Can you imagine if the Pilgrims had actually made it to Virginia and they had settled in Virginia? What would have happened? And not gotten blown off course and settled up in Massachusetts, but would they have just become kind of a side note to American history? Would there have been anything else to it? Because at that point, Virginia had already established this very plantation-driven society. They were in the process of that. They were certainly dominated by a different kind of culture. And if the Pilgrims had shown up in in Virginia, not Massachusetts, and then the Puritans would have also landed in Virginia and skipped Massachusetts, what would have happened? We had the English Civil War in the 1640s. Would that have broken out in Virginia as well? Because we know the governor of Virginia really didn't care for the Puritans very much. So that would they have been crushed in American history might have changed forever. I mean, I don't know. But this chance of the Pilgrims actually landing in Massachusetts and trying to forge this very New England-centric vision of America has actually been successful because of historians. But as people learn more and more about this, and in fact, the reason I'm doing this today is because, of course, we have the Virginia First project at Abbeville Institute. Go to 1607 Project. You can go to Abbeville Institute and just look it up. But the title of the book is Virginia First. Go to Amazon.com. It's there. We also have the documentary on YouTube. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can catch it there too. Just go to our channel, Abbeville Institute, and pick up that documentary free of charge, right? Everything is the book you have to pay for, but the documentary is free of charge. Share it around. We get into the first Thanksgiving, English Thanksgiving. It's not there in Massachusetts. It's in Virginia. And I think Sean McGowan did a really nice job explaining this. He's a Presbyterian minister, and we unfortunately have adopted a very New England-centric view of America. So Thanksgiving should be more Southern than Northern. Now, the holiday that we gather around in November now is based on this New England version of things, but really should be Virginia. Virginia should be first in all of this. The South really was the most important foundational part of what people thought of the United States for much of American history, early American history in particular, and that changes after the war is over. But when you think about the most important Americans in the founding period, there are some Northerners in that group, but I mean, two of the three that really come to mind are Jefferson and Washington, two Virginians, and the father of the Constitution's a Virginian. Of course, we have the Adams there in New England. We have Ben Franklin from Pennsylvania, Hamilton from New York. But where would America be without Jefferson, Washington, and Madison? I mean, we can debate whether Madison really is the father of the Constitution or not. But regardless, that's what he's called. The father of the Bill of Rights is George Mason of Virginia. I mean, where would we be without these people, right? Even if you want to go onto the other side, the nationalist side, where would the nationalists be without the Virginian John Marshall? So Virginia really does dominate our conception of early federal America. It should dominate our conception of colonial America as well. Now, the 1619 Project of Nicole Hannah-Jones tried to make Virginia the center of all that, but not because it was good, because it was bad, and that was the point of the book. Kevin Gutzman wrote a very nice essay on the original intent of 1619, why that should be an important year in Virginia. And we have a great essay on that very topic as well in Virginia First, written by John Devaney, who was a great supporter of the Institute. So one of our foundational scholars. So we have to fully understand the impact of Virginia on America. And hopefully this is what, when we explore what is true and valuable in the Southern tradition, and this podcast does that too, you'll walk away after I go through this piece thinking, yeah, we should really think about Virginia first and not New England. In fact, Lion Gardner Tyler wrote an essay, which is in that book as well. It's the very first essay in the book, kicks it off, Virginia First, where he talks about the importance of Virginia. So again, this piece is by Sean McGowan, titled Love Thanksgiving, Thank Virginia. And we published it at the Abbeville Institute on November 28th, 2024. I'm recording this on the 29th, so yesterday. And again, get the 1607 Project, Virginia First, and we've got material on this in there as well. And get that documentary. So McGowan says, when most Americans think of the first Thanksgiving, they think of the Pilgrims in Plymouth who sat down for a harvest festival meal with the Wampanoag Indians in 1621. The Pilgrims had arrived on the Mayflower in November of 1620, and nearly a year later celebrated the abundance of provisions that God had provided. The Thanksgiving tradition recalls to memory Indians like Squanto and Englishmen like William Bradford, who was elected governor in the early 1621. Many American Christians love to quote the words of Governor Bradford in his Thanksgiving proclamation, made 3 years after the Pilgrims settled in Plymouth, where he proclaimed that all Pilgrim families were to gather on November 29, 1623, to hear from their minister and give thanks to Almighty God. Thus, when Americans think of Thanksgiving, they think of Massachusetts and the Pilgrims. Now, this is entirely true. That first paragraph is kind of where we are in America with this holiday of Thanksgiving. If you go to your local church and you have a Thanksgiving celebration, whether you're Protestant or Catholic, that's going to be addressed. Even Catholic churches celebrate Thanksgiving in this way, even though the first Catholic Thanksgiving, again, was in Florida. But generally, you're going to have this kind of view, and when you're in elementary school, this is the standard narrative. There's nothing incorrect about this paragraph. He's just laying out where we are in America with our understanding of Thanksgiving. But he says, however, what many do not realize is that there was an English Thanksgiving on American soil over 1 year prior to the Pilgrims landing in Plymouth and almost 2 years before they celebrated the Harvest Festival with the Indians. The first Thanksgiving occurred in Virginia. True. He says the evidence for this is scarce, and the event was more than likely unknown even by most Virginians until the 20th century. One of the primary men involved in the voyage, John Smith of Nibley, was a historian who documented the settlement in Virginia from 1609 to 1622. It is the only known source that documents the Barclay expedition and the first Thanksgiving in Virginia. This collection, a work of 38 papers, was first discovered by Dr. Lyon Tyler, son of President John Tyler, and former president of the College of William and Mary. After researching the documents, Dr. Tyler published an article of his findings in the Richmond News Leader in April of 1931. Now, Tyler had already been working on this, and he had already made some statements about it before he published his full findings in 31. But it's interesting how this was suppressed or buried, if nothing else, for years. And this calls to mind some of the other things we talk about today, like, for example, the first Memorial Day or Decoration Day. Was it in Charleston, South Carolina, or was it in Columbus, Georgia, or Columbus, Mississippi? Columbus, Georgia should take the credit because they were the ones that came up with the idea. But you've got people like David Blight running around saying that the first Decoration Day was actually in Charleston, South Carolina in 1865. And we can't say anything else. So are people willing to, who would say that because they're trying to take that away from the South, would they be willing to say that the first Thanksgiving was actually in Virginia? That we should be celebrating Virginia, not Massachusetts? I don't know. Maybe they would. Maybe they'd be intellectually honest. I have no idea. Now, we can quibble with this idea of the first Memorial Day, but regardless. So McGowan says this, the story of the first Thanksgiving. The story begins 11 years after the Jamestown settlement, with 4 men from Gloucester who met in London in 1618, planning to sail for Virginia on a quest for profit. The men were William Throckmorton, Richard Barclay, George Thorpe, and John Smith, or Barclay, I should say, not to be confused with the other John Smith of Jamestown. King James I had granted a good amount of land to the 4, and they called it Barclay. Plans took shape for the Barclay settlement, and on September 4, 1619, the men chose John Woodleaf, alternate spelling Woodleaf, it's a different way, as their captain. Woodleaf was one of the survivors of the starving time in Jamestown, and surprisingly was willing to go back to the colony. I mean, that is pretty amazing. There's a little video on YouTube that has Graham Woodleaf, who is a descendant of John Woodleaf, talking about this event, and it's really phenomenal. I mean, but can you imagine going through the starving time and then getting out of there and then saying, yeah, I'll go back? It's pretty remarkable when you think about it. I mean, who would want to do that? But notice a couple of things about this. Number one, this was a quest for profit. These men were coming over to America not to create something new, some new kind of utopian society like the Pilgrims or even the Puritans, but to make some money. They wanted to have plantations They wanted to have cash crops. This was an opportunity for them. They wanted to recreate the lifestyle that they had in England with new land. I mean, if you think about Virginia, it was a different vision for what America should be. It was a business venture. These were people that were trying to make money. They weren't creating a city on a hill or some type of utopian religious community. No. This is what when I started this podcast, I mentioned, what would happen if the Pilgrims had actually landed in Virginia instead of Massachusetts? Would things have been different? Would they have just become a curiosity and maybe dissolved at some point? I don't know. Would they have gone somewhere else eventually, kind of booted out of Virginia? It's a good question. But it's all for naught because the Pilgrims landed in Massachusetts. But again, Woodley's story is pretty remarkable. He was willing to go back. The good ship Margaret, leased by Woodleaf, departed Bristol, England on September 16, 1619, destined for the Barclay land on the James River in Virginia. The trip was plagued by severe storms. The people on board clung for dear life and pleaded with the Lord for mercy. On November 28th, they arrived in the Chesapeake Bay. 2 days later, they made their way into what is now the Hampton Roads, and then finally on December 4th, 1619, they arrived at Barclay. After the men rowed ashore, we are told that Captain Woodleaf commanded the group to kneel and pray. Woodleaf prayed, quote, "We ordain that this day of our ship's arrival at the place assigned for the plantation in the land of Virginia shall be yearly and perpetually kept holy as a day of thanksgiving to Almighty God." Now, this was actually part of the charter. They were supposed to do this. And according to some of the accounts of this, they disembarked, they rowed ashore, disembarked, got out, looked around at the woods, stood in silence, and then knelt and prayed for a thanksgiving. McGowan says, thus America's first official English Thanksgiving had occurred. Note that there was no food. There was no harvest festival, but only deep, reverent prayers of thankfulness to Almighty God for his protection over their voyage. This was to be perpetually kept as a day of thanks to the Lord. Now, what McGowan does not mention here, of course, is that this was actually kept for the next couple of years. 1620, 1621, they did this on December 4th for those years. It failed to be perpetual because in 1622 there was an Indian war in Virginia between the Virginians and the Powhatans, and, well, these people were wiped out. It was a massacre. And so there was no longer a perpetual Thanksgiving at the Barclay plantation. It's the sad part of this, right? The sad part of the story. So the reason that we no longer remember this Virginia event is because there was violence that kept it from happening. And then, of course, it's lost over time. Now, we know the New England event was remembered because, well, I mean, there was Indian violence in these areas too, and there were Indian wars, and there was some hard times, but fortunately, I mean, for those people, they generally survived. I mean, some of them, you look at the initial settlers, there's very few of them that actually made it through. I think there were about 50 of the initial settlers in Plymouth survived the 1 year after that very difficult winter. But they were able to perpetually have this remembrance. Bradford in 1623, we're going to keep this thing going. And they did because, of course, the Massachusetts Bay Colony would then flourish as the Puritans showed up and things began to turn for the better. Virginia eventually prospered too, but by that point, people had forgotten about this very early English Thanksgiving, the 1619 Thanksgiving in Virginia, this one that was held also in 1620 and 1621. Now, what would this mean for America? What would it mean if Virginia was first in this? It would generally change our perspective on what it means to be a colonial American or an American in general. Virginia being first would mean that the American experience was much more cavalier and far less puritanical. It would mean that Americans were not looking for quote-unquote religious liberty, as is often described. And Americans came over here for religious liberty. No, it would mean they were coming over here to make money. It would mean that Americans were simply looking to fulfill a conservative part of their life. They were trying to recreate what they already had. They were trying to bring the traditions of England with them. And of course, notice this was also religious. These people weren't anti-religion at all. I mean, they were very devout Christians. But they weren't separatists. They were not nonconformists. They were people that liked English society and English life. They were people that were expressing a tradition that they loved on the shores of North America, in Virginia. They were not trying to do something else. They were not rejecting what they already had. They were conservative with a lowercase c. They loved the tradition that they already had. And a lot of what we do in America has some type of old English tradition attached to it. It's also why when you start talking about the first Thanksgiving in Florida, it's a Spanish event. The Spanish had minimal impact outside of the Gulf Coast on the United States moving forward. I know there are some people that will dispute that, but when you look at the political traditions in the United States, the Anglo-American tradition is the dominant tradition, right? Political and legal tradition. It's what matters. And so regardless of where you're from originally, I mean, you could be from anywhere and then settled in the United States, your family at some point, that is what you were living under, the Anglo-American political and legal tradition. So this is why these English Thanksgivings matter. Now, this thing's gone, right? It's buried. It's gone, lost. We've got the Pilgrims. We've got Sarah Hale pushing for this new New England-centric vision. Abraham Lincoln, 1863, kind of codifies that. And then, now, there's another reason why Lincoln did this too, and it's why he chose the date that he did and why he issued the proclamation on the date that he did. It's because he was trying to attach himself to George Washington, by the way. But regardless, we have all of this history with it, but maybe there's something else to this. And as this picked up steam, and here we have in the early 20th century, historians start to reconsider the impact of Virginia on these very first things. For example, the other thing Virginia was first in was representative government. They had the first representative government in North America. Not the Pilgrims, the Mayflower Compact, which was forced on the members of the church. If you didn't sign it, you were booted out of the colony and sent off to the adventurers' settlement. So that's not very democratic, but we had this elected assembly in Virginia. I mean, these people were following the English political tradition, the Anglo tradition. They loved it. These were their people. This was their thing. So as we move forward in time, the 20th century, people discover this. I talked about Tyler, and McGowan gets into some of that. So let me talk about this. He says, since the discovery and publication of this Thanksgiving account, there have been forced acknowledgements of its history. One notable example took place during the Kennedy administration. Oh, lo and behold. And that's remarkable because, of course, Kennedy's from Massachusetts. Now, he's not Old English stock. The Kennedys are Irish. So it's a little different. But for a man from Massachusetts to recognize that there could be something more to this than just Massachusetts is pretty remarkable. In November of 1962, a former state senator and attorney from Virginia, John J. Wicker, sent a letter to President Kennedy criticizing his 1962 Thanksgiving proclamation where the president gave full credit to the Pilgrims of Massachusetts. Senator Wicker pointed out that the records indicated that Virginia, not Massachusetts, deserved the credit. Wicker received a response from historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. on behalf of the president acknowledging the mistake. So, if you don't know, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. was a court historian, and what I mean by that is that he was the president's man, right? His job was to write the history of the presidency, and His family were court historians. We don't think of the presidency now as creating a court, but it does. I mean, there's all kinds of examples of this. But we have a court in Washington, D.C. now, just like we used to have in England or France with the monarchy. We have it in D.C., and we have a court historian. We get court historians around the presidency all the time. We see it right now. Heather Cox Richardson is kind of the court historian for the Biden administration. That's her job. When we are going to have Donald Trump, we'll have somebody from the Claremont Institute be the court historian for the Donald Trump administration. They like to have somebody that's going to write a very positive spin of their administration. And, Heather Cox Richardson has done that very nicely. Nicely not because it's correct, but because she's just, a sycophant. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. was that exact same thing. Now, interesting enough, Schlesinger Jr. wrote this book in the 90s called Disuniting America, where he talked about multiculturalism being a danger to the United States. Now, again, he's a World War II guy, born in 1917, was around during the post-war period, this euphoric period of time where America becomes the superpower, and where, during the 1930s and 40s, we basically had zero immigration into the United States. And there was certainly this kind of robust American nationalism. It's the exception rather than the rule, though, for how that would work. And by the 1990s, Schlesinger was concerned about all the immigration coming in and all this multiculturalism and what it was doing to this Anglo-American character. He would be raked over the coals for this today. But of course, here he's at least being intellectually honest. Now, Schlesinger also wrote a book on Andrew Jackson, among other things. Schlesinger wrote a lot of stuff. He wrote about the imperial presidency. It's an interesting book on the heels of the Nixon administration, where he's very critical of the powers of the presidency. He was at least honest at times. I think that his book, The Age of Jackson, has got some issues. But regardless, I would take Arthur Schlesinger over most of the fools who are writing over Heather Cox Richardson every day of the week. According to Schlesinger, the era was a result of the unconquerable New England bias on the part of the White House staff. The unconquerable New England bias on the part of the White House staff. I love that line. The problem is we've got these New Englanders in the office and they don't know this stuff. To his credit, in his 1963 Thanksgiving proclamation, just weeks before the assassination, President Kennedy gave credit to Virginia alongside of Massachusetts. Kennedy said, quote, "Over 3 centuries ago, our forefathers in Virginia and in Massachusetts, far from a home in a lonely wilderness, set aside a time of thanksgiving. On the appointed day, they gave reverent thanks for their safety, for the health of their children, for the fertility of their fields, for the love which bound them together, and for the faith which united them with their God." Of course, that part, with their God, it's kind of a early PC thing. But at least Kennedy is saying we've got Virginia and Massachusetts. We have Virginia and in Massachusetts. And he's saying, look, this is good. So Kennedy, of course, is assassinated in November of 1963. So McGowan says, this Thanksgiving, as we thank Almighty God for all that he has done and remember his faithfulness to his past generations, let us also remember his protection over the Barclay crew that sailed to Virginia. As we tell the story of Thanksgiving, let us honor the Barclay voyagers who had their priorities right and stop to pray to the living God after setting foot on Virginia soil and proclaimed a perpetual day of Thanksgiving. And let us further remember that all of this was before the Pilgrims even departed on the Mayflower. All of that is true. This is why when we talk about an essential Southern podcast, what's essential in the Southern tradition? Well, if we talk about the first things, then we have to mention Thanksgiving. Virginia first. If we talk about the first legislative assembly, we have to talk about Virginia. If we talk about the importance of some of the members of the founding generation, Virginia has to come up in that conversation. In other words, Virginia has to be, the South in general, there's different parts of the South. no doubt, but this Virginia-centric vision of America has to be there, at least has to be reckoned with. When the war was over in 1865, the effort was made to reduce that, to essentially make the South the evil other, the insignificant other in the process of forging an America. But there is more than one American tradition. I think this is what Southerners had realized for a long time, and Northerners too. It's just that we've tried to wash one away and make the other prominent. And our goal at the Abbeville Institute is, again, to explore what is true and valuable in the Southern tradition. And what's true in this is that Virginia was first. What's valuable is that the Southern tradition should have greater weight in the American story. And that Virginians were also giving thanks for what they had and showing gratitude to God for what they had when they landed in Virginia in 1619. Until next time, good day.